and we'll have a tea break in between. We have four distinguished speakers in this particular panel, which I see seems to be a panel on Bengal, actually. All the four papers, one way or other, they deal with Bengal. So that's quite interesting. So I guess one will get some deeper understanding of how Bengal relates to the First World War. Before the break, we have two speakers, and what I will do is introduce the first two speakers, and then we go for a tea break, and then I will introduce the second two speakers, and then we'll open for discussion. So you have to bear with us for some time before the floor will be open for you to interact and ask questions and comments. The first speaker that we have, we already know him, Squadron Leader Rana China. And I guess the profile is there in front of you. And we have heard him yesterday also while he was chairing one of the sessions. And he's going to speak on Bhadralok warriors, the Bengali military experience in the First World War. 20 minutes would do?
Yes.
Okay, please.
Thank you, Professor Imtiaz Ahmed. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to be here, and it might be a bit surprising to have a Punjabi talking about Bengali experiences, but as Professor Richard Fogarty had said in the previous session, stranger things have been known to happen. I will not presume to make any assumptions, but I may get some things wrong, so please do bear with me, and I would be very, very grateful for feedback at the end of this talk. I must also say that the paper is pretty much a work in progress. I haven't plugged all the loopholes. When Monsieur Olivier Litwin asked me to present this paper, I readily agreed, and when he asked me to suggest what I would like to talk on, this was instinctively the very first thing that came to my mind, since I thought it might be of particular interest to this audience. So, and I should also like to say here that I am extremely grateful to the Alliance Française de Dhaka for giving me this opportunity of being in such a distinguished seat, being the opportunity to speak at such a distinguished seat of learning. And I'm extremely sorry that Monsieur Litwin cannot be here with us today. The talk, I'll be focusing basically on three aspects. It's a very broad-based, general kind of a talk as of now, which I covered these aspects of Bengali involvement in the First World War, and by no means do they cover the entire gamut of that engagement, but are substantially representative of it. I should also like to say that I'm not touching upon the political aspects. This is purely from the military engagement during that conflict. The three things that I will cover, firstly is the Bengal Volunteer Ambulance Corps, the Indian Army's Bengali Infantry Unit, which is the 49th Bengalis, and the Bengali Aviators in the Royal Flying Corps. I'm conscious that in recent years, the 49th Bengalis have received a certain amount of academic attention. There have been 2 excellent articles and even a book by one of the speakers at this conference itself. However, I do feel justified in attempting to add to that pool of knowledge, since I do think I had came across some primary source records which the earlier scholars did not have access to. So before I begin to deal with the specifics of that military involvement of Bengal in the First World War, I think it's imperative that we place that involvement in a context to gain a greater understanding of the forces that were at play and the atmosphere that prevailed when war came to India in 1914. in order to do so, I think you may bear in mind that very, very broadly and I think superficially, perhaps speaking, there were two major strains of political expression. One were the moderates, and the other perhaps was the extreme or revolutionary element. And Bengal shares with Punjab the distinction of perhaps leading in the latter. There was a very, very strong element of revolutionary fervor amongst the youth in both of these provinces. And this is represented by, of course, the rise of the revolutionary movement, which later takes the shape of the Anushilan Samiti, and in Punjab, the Ghadar Party. We've already heard about the Ghadarites in our first session today. This enhanced political consciousness was a source of great concern to the colonial authorities. And secondly, the British Indian Army was one of the strongest pillars in the edifice of the colonial state in India. And one of the central ideologies around which this army was structured was the martial races theory, which restricted recruitment to a narrow demographic base. And this theory was, as you may be aware, was based more upon a combination of Victorian social Darwinism and indigenous caste hierarchies, and it had as much to do with the ornamentalist view and self-image of the European colonial elite as it had to do with the way they imagined their colonial subjects. By this, the British government decided or determined which ethnic groups and subgroups were competent to bear arms in the service of the Raj. And this was similar in some ways to the French system of dividing their subject peoples into the race guerrière and race non-guerrière. At the turn of the 19th century, the bulk of the Indian Army came from the so-called hardy races of the north. These soldiers came from rural communities. Many of them were illiterate. There was almost no representation in the army from Bengal, although a number of Bengalis did serve as Lashkars in the Royal Indian Marine. However, the unprecedented manpower demands of the Great War put traditional recruiting areas under great strain and subsequently opened the door for enlistment from many classes hitherto labeled as non-martial. And these included ethnic Bengalis, Punjabi Christians, Anglo-Indians, so on and so forth. But we'll stick to the Bengali experience. The first of the elements that I spoke of was the Bengal Ambulance Corps. The exclusion of Bengali youth from military service was a subject of great resentment in Bengal, and many amongst the educated elite saw the war as an opportunity to press their demands with the colonial authorities. So when war was declared in August 1914, an offer was made for an ambulance corps for service in Europe. A large number of young men volunteered, but there was great disappointment when the offer was turned down by the military authorities on the grounds that they did not wish to be saddled with a large number of well-meaning but untrained non-combatants. Just a very quick aside to that, I mean, I think was very natural for Bengal to offer an ambulance corps. The Bengali elite had a very strong predominance in the medical services and the other professions. And in the Indian Army, till very recently, the Army Medical Corps, which is abbreviated as the AMC, used to be known as the BMC because it was the predominance of Bengali officers as medical officers. In November 1914, the Bengal Medical Association again pressed upon the government with a proposal, and they offered, firstly, to provide a sufficient number of individual medical practitioners to be commissioned as medical officers in the Indian Medical Service. And the IMS, or the Indian Medical Service, was the only branch in the Indian Army in which Indians could hold the King's Commission. Otherwise, they only were allowed to enter into subordinate ranks. The highest rank that they were permitted to hold was the Viceroy's Commission in the combatant arms. But the IMS, they could enter as officers. Secondly, the Bengal Medical Association petitioned, and they suggested that they would form a united corps of medical men and ambulance bearers as Bengal's contribution to the war effort. The proposed unit was to consist of 15 surgeons and assistant surgeons and 175 compounders, dressers, bearers, nurses, etc. I actually found this suggestion to include nurses very interesting because there was, they actually never, women were not deployed in war theaters. Even the Europeans did not permit nurses to nurse wounded Indian soldiers for various other reasons, more to do with gender and race than anything else. So there were numerous volunteers came in for field ambulance. Veterinary surgeons offered to work with veterinary hospitals. Motor mechanics said we'll work with mechanized motor ambulance. And the BMA said they were to contribute men, while the funds to maintain the corps were to be raised by public subscription. By the end of January 1915, Dr. S.P. Sarbadikari and Mr. Bhupendranath Basu had raised 1.5 lakhs, that's 150,000 rupees, and registered over 700 volunteers, of which 200 were to form the first unit. In March 1915, the Viceroy acknowledged that it would be most probably employed in Mesopotamia. The British accepted this offer. In May, the BAC presented a 2-decker river flat of 400 tons, which was to be used as a floating hospital in Mesopotamia. It was named the Bengali, and for that time, it was a state-of-the-art hospital. It was equipped with 100 beds, 2 operating theaters, X-ray machines, refrigerators. It's really top of the line. But the cost of maintaining and equipping the unit and the hospital, as I said, was to be met entirely from voluntary contributions from the population of Bengal. The vessel sailed for Mesopotamia on the 10th of May. This is when the monsoon was about to strike, and it was being towed to the Shatt al-Arab, and about 260 miles out to sea, it capsized and it sank. So the future of the Bengal Ambulance Corps was once again uncertain. But towards the end of June, ultimately 5 officers, 4 Indian officers, 66 men and 40 followers left Howrah for Bombay en route to Mesopotamia. Instead of serving on a floating hospital as originally intended, they would now serve very creditably at what became known as the Bengal Stationary Hospital at Amara, which was 150 miles upstream from Basra on the Tigris, and they continued to serve there for well over a year. An ambulance section was detached from the main hospital and served in the front lines along with the British force. It was a 6th Indian Division, which was advancing up the Tigris towards Baghdad. And all the men of this ambulance volunteered to serve by rotation in the front lines. By January 1916, the BAC had suffered its first casualties in action, with 6 privates missing, believed prisoners of war. There is a photograph of a book in Bengali which describes the experiences of this unit. And I've actually used this with permission of Amitabh Ghosh. He has a blog and he's translating part of this. And for those of you who are interested, if you Google it, you'll find some very interesting accounts in English of the experiences of the men of the Bengal Ambulance Corps. Now, the BAC then served creditably by all accounts and was favorably reported upon by the British authorities. Its personnel accompanied the 6th Indian Division under the over-ambitious Major General Charles Townshend up the Tigris until he was defeated at the Battle of Ctesiphon, and then he fell back and voluntarily locked himself up into the loop of the Tigris at Kotal Amara, where they were besieged, and the attempt to relieve Kotal Amara cost the British many thousands of casualties. Ultimately, the garrison was forced to surrender. They were on the verge of starvation, and a large number of men of the ambulance corps also went into captivity along with the rest of the garrison. Being ambulance personnel, they were repatriated a little later, while the rest of the Indian prisoners were not quite as lucky, and a lot of them suffered terribly at the hands of the Turks. By the middle of 1916, the Bengal Ambulance Corps wound up. The scheme's promoters agreed to hand over the hospital to government as a growing concern and to organize a stretcher corps instead for advance work at the front, but this latter part never materialized. Of the 98 men who left Bengal a year ago, 23 were prisoners of war of the Turks, 17 having been taken at Kut, and 6 at Ctesiphon. A private who had returned from the siege of Kut was carried on a chair draped with the British ensign to a waiting motor car when these returning prisoners of war came back to Calcutta. The other men were garlanded and similarly escorted to a fleet of private motor cars. En route to the headquarters of the Corps, crowds lined the roads and several Bengali patriotic songs were sung along with the British national anthem. This ambulance corps was favorably reported on by the military authorities, and its dissolution then paved the way for the next step, which is the formation of the Bengali combatant unit. Now, it's actually interesting to note that the initial demand for Bengali representation in the army came not in the form of regular military service as then prevailed throughout India, but as the right to serve in the quasi-official volunteer force. The volunteer movement actually started in India in the aftermath of the Great Uprising of 1857, which you can call, the British called the Great Mutiny. Indian nationalist historiography refers to it as the First War of Independence. The reality perhaps lies somewhere in between these two. But the volunteer movement in itself had its roots in the European response to that cataclysmic event. And as such, volunteer units were very similar to territorial units of a later date and were composed entirely of Europeans resident in India. They very grudgingly allowed a few Anglo-Indians and men of Portuguese descent into their ranks, but it wasn't until the formation of the Indian Defence Force in late 1917 that Indians were permitted to join. So the Bengali demand to be a part of the volunteer movement is significant in this regard, as it sought a parity with the Europeans, which they felt that their education and social background entitled them to. They did not want to be on par with the Indian Army, which was kept a rung below its British counterpart in terms of pay and privileges, but desired throughout to be equated with the British soldiers in terms of pay, rank nomenclature, and even uniforms. They didn't want to be called sepoys and havildars, they wanted to be called privates, sergeants, and so on and so forth. It's significant that the 49th Bengalis, when they do come into existence, subsequently wore not the turban of the sepoy, but the slouch hat favored by Gurkhas, Australians, and New Zealanders. But I move ahead of my story. Initial requests in 1914-15 to allow the Bengalis to enlist were not entertained by the colonial authorities, and once again, disappointment at not being allowed to volunteer for combat service was very keenly felt. And the New Statesman, this is one of the newspaper reports, says that it condemns the earlier decision of government and says that the sight of Europeans parading on the Maidan while they themselves are denied the right to enlist must have been very galling to the Bengalis' sense of self-respect. Taking the cue from another section of Indian society that had been consistently denied the opportunity of military service under the Raj, namely the Anglo-Indians, the demand for military representation for Bengalis was once again raised, this time by Dr. S.K. Malik, who was Honorary Secretary of the National Militia League. A word about the Anglo-Indians. There are several uses or connotations to the use of this term. In this context, it is the children of marriages between usually 9 times out of 10 European men and Indian women. There were a few other cases, but it almost inevitably referred to this class of people. And for very obvious reasons, the way the whole racial construct was developed by the colonial society, the Anglo-Indians were outside the acknowledgement of the colonial power. So interestingly enough, coming back to the proposal by S.K. Malik, when he proposes, he says that the Anglo-Indians have been permitted to form what was known as the Anglo-Indian Force, and what is your reason or justification for not permitting the same concession or allowing the same concession to the Bengalis? And his proposal, the initial proposal to enlist Bengalis in the armed forces, uses the Anglo-Indian Force as a model, and the AIF did not serve as a composite unit, but was used as a manpower tool to augment the strength of existing units. And the memorandum initially submitted by Dr. Malik proposed the raising not of a single unit, but a field troop of cavalry, a section of field artillery, and 4 platoons of infantry. However, when the General Staff branch at Army Headquarters was asked to comment on the proposal, which had been reported in the press, it tersely remarked in May 1916, beyond, and I quote, "Beyond the fact that the Bengali press is full of enthusiastic articles on the subject, this branch knows nothing about the proposal," unquote. Later, commenting upon the proposal, the GOC Lucknow division, under whom Bengal fell at that point in time, said that while there was no requirement from a military point of view to enlist them, it might be expedient to give Bengalis the opportunity of military service as a political necessity. And he was inclined to try special class companies for service in existing Indian Army units, and suggested that these companies were composed of all classes except menials, and he further suggested that the composition should be 50% Hindu and 50% Muslim, with recruitment restricted to the Burdwan and Presidency divisions, from which they could get, quote, real Bengalis, unquote. The Deputy Adjutant, Assistant Adjutant General, Brigadier C.W. Richardson, condescendingly suggested that this might be a suitable opportunity to, quote, give the Bengali a run for his money by offering him a chance of military service in an innocuous form, unquote. He suggested that a special double company could be raised from the center of Bengal, Calcutta itself for choice, and attached for training to an existing unit on the northwest frontier, and then sent for service overseas, attached to an existing battalion in Mesopotamia. He felt that this ploy of what he considered as calling the Bengali bluff was a win-win situation for the British. By enlisting Bengalis as soldiers on the same terms and conditions as applied to the rest of India, the proposal would lose favor among the educated Bengali class that was agitating for it. And he stressed that enlistment on the terms of ordinary sepoys was not what the Bengalis wanted, and unless the Bengal Committee admitted defeat at the very outset, it would have to make every effort to provide the number of men required for the proposed unit. He said if they succeeded, it was good for them, and if they failed or proved useless in the field, quote, government will be provided with the strongest argument against any further consideration of similar disingenuous ebullitions on the part of these political propagandists, unquote. The Commander-in-Chief, Beauchamp Duff, concurred with the suggestion. Before implementing it, the file was sent to the Home Department for perusal, where the background for the recruitment drive was described in a report by Sir Charles Cleveland, the Director of Criminal Intelligence. And he noted that the Bengalis should be made into, he noted that the idea that the Bengalis should be made into soldiers had long been prevalent amongst various classes for various reasons. The Dhaka maneuvers, he's giving a history of where this idea comes from. He said the Dhaka maneuvers stimulated a desire for martial employment amongst the Bhadralok who saw or read of them. The idea grew with the outbreak of the war. Makhanlal Sen, a well-known leader, started a list for a volunteer corps, but put on a majority of revolutionary youths in it. Then subsequently, all these schemes he felt were to be preambles to the real thing, that's military service. He said the ultimate end of this whole exercise is military service is what is being demanded by the Bengalis. And the aims, he felt, of this committee that was agitating for Bengali enlistment, shown on the slide. It said they want to stake a big political claim, they want to raise the popular status of the Bengali Bhadralok, they want to provide honorable employment for the Bhadralok, and to emulate the Bhadralok of Chandanagar and Pondicherry, who have become recruits, and there's the French connection, to do something for the war and to insist on similar privileges to those granted Anglo-Indians. So ultimately, the experiment, or the British approved of the formation of a Bengali double company, which by the time it was transformed into reality, there were enough volunteers to actually form an entire unit, which came to be known as the 49th Bengalis. The 49th Bengalis was deployed on lines of communication in Mesopotamia. They were to be deployed in the front, but subsequently it was found that there were problems with the climate and with the health of the men, and the unit actually had an incident which had nothing to do with politics, but it had everything to do with internal jealousies, in which two men entered the tent of the sleeping Bengali Indian officers, the VCOs, and they shot 3 of them, killed 1 and wounded 2, including the Subedar Major. The British were obviously very delighted that this had happened, and they kept them back from the front line and subsequently sent them back to India, where the unit was disbanded along with the rest of the demobilization of the Indian Army in 1920. Then I'll actually, I miscalculated my talk. So that was the end as far as the Bengali unit was concerned. The other aspect was, we just go down straight to the air races, please. There were, during World War I, there were 4 Indians that served on in the Royal Flying Corps. 2 of them were Bengalis. One of them was Lieutenant Indralal Sen, known as Laddie Roy. Just go down, next slide. Yeah, next. Laddie Roy, although he was born in Calcutta, he moved to England at the age of 2, and he was studying in St. Paul's, Darjeeling. And he was the first Indian to shoot down 9 aircraft and to be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. He was killed in action over German lines on July 1918. The second airman was, and that's a sketch which he had done of the aircraft he had shot down. He was wounded, went into hospital, recovered, again volunteered for frontline flying, and came back and was killed. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, and the second chap was ESC Sen, who was seated on the extreme left in this slide. Sen's father was a Bengali who was married to a lady of English parentage who was also born in Calcutta, and his father died in 1915. He joined the Royal Flying Corps in 1917. His other brother was in the Honorable Artillery Company, which was a British Army unit. Next slide, please. And there he is with his Sopwith Camel. And Sen was shot down in 1917. He managed to crash land his aircraft next. And spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, as a POW at the Holzminden prisoner of war camp in Germany. Other aspects that Bengalis were recruited in or served in was the Indian Medical Service, the Indian Defence Force, the Royal Indian Marine. I'm not going to go into that. There are, in the IMS, next slide, there are 2 biographies by IMS officers. One, of course, is what Kaushik is going to talk about, and the second one is Life of an Indian IMS officer, which I've just given a copy of that for the Dhaka library. It was put together by General Palit, related to his father, who'd served in France in World War I, and he published his diary. So, in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I'll say that while the Bengal military experiment of the Great War didn't serve to immediately break down the carefully constructed barriers of colonial racial prejudice, it did substantially contribute to bringing about an acceptance of a broad-based Indian involvement in aspects of the military in India. In 1917, the doors of the volunteer movement, which were thrown open to Indians of all classes, and this transformed into the more egalitarian Indian Territorial Force in 1922. Indians also became eligible for the King's Commission in 1919 in combatant arms. And about more than a decade later, when the first batch of Indians set sail for Cranwell to be commissioned as officers and pilots in the Indian Air Force when it was formed, 2 of the 6 cadets were Bengalis, one of whom was none other than Subrata Mukherjee, who later rose to be the first Indian chief of air staff of the Indian Air Force, and was again none other than a nephew of late Lieutenant Indralal Roy. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ranachini. Mr. Ranachini, we will have a discussion on his paper. If you have any comments and questions, please keep it with you after we hear Dr. Kaushik Roy and after the tea break. The next paper is by Dr. Roy, who is...
Will you take a question? Sorry.
Later? After we have Dr. Roy's presentation and after the tea break. Then we'll have the two other speakers, and then we'll open the floor. So you have to have some patience for that. Dr. Roy is currently in a university which I'm very familiar with, Jadavpur University. He is there as Guru Nanak Professor in the Department of History, and he has written extensively on issues relating to history, particularly military history. Dr. Roy, 20 minutes? Would that do? Okay.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I thank AFD for inviting me here, and also the chair for introducing me, and also Dhaka University for hosting the seminar. I will speak about a Bengali IMS, Indian Medical Service officer, who served in Mesopotamia during 1914 to 16. Before I go into the details, let me contextualize this autobiography within the greater historiographical matrix. When I speak about the historiography of First World War, I will only speak about what we call Anglo-Saxon historiography, or the history which is generated from Britain and USA, because unfortunately I do not have the linguistic skill to read French or German books. Several strands in the historiographical matrix of First World War or the Great War could be discerned. One dominant strand which remains in operation still now and which started from the 1920s is the focus on great battles and decisive campaigns of the First World War, especially on the Western Front. How the British Army fought at Flanders, what happened at Somme, trench warfare, techniques of trench warfare, techniques of stormtrooper tactics, Kaiser's battle, Kaiser's offensive 1918, etc., etc. 60s, 70s, the historiographical pointer shifted a bit, and then the historians continued to focus on operational military history, but it extended to the Eastern Front, Normanstone's war, and how the Russians fought, how the Romanians fought, and also how the British Army fought at Mesopotamia and at North Africa, Syria, Palestine, where the Indian Army appears as a marginal footnote. 80s, 90s marks a great change where, due to the operation or influence of the post-colonial studies, cultural historiography, feminism, postmodernism, then the focus is on not on high politics military operations, but also on what you call the experiences and perception of soldiers. But it remained more or less confined within how the European soldiers fought and experienced First World War. In the new millennium, there is a definite also a semi-break when we are studying how the colonials themselves perceived or experienced the effect of war. And this seminar, which is partly within the last historiographical school, and my paper also fits within it. One, there are two big problems of studying the perceptions and experiences of Indian soldiers. One is ideological, and that is purely empirical. What is the ideological? Within India, due to the grip of Indian nationalist historiography, that Indian National Congress, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, they gave freedom, independence. The role of Indian collaborators, quote unquote, or the Indian soldiers who fought loyally and bravely for the imperial power Britain, in the two world wars, it doesn't fit in nicely. And the Marxist influence also in Indian historiography, focuses on the agrarian scenario, economy, but not really on armies and warfare. It's categorized as marginal. The other problem of history from below for the Indian soldiers is really empirical. I mean, I am working at the Indian Army sources both in Britain and in India for more than 1 decade, but most of the soldiers being illiterate, they have left us with no autobiography or no letters, didn't survive. I mean, Indians do not generally keep letters or private papers unlike the British. And that's a problem. We don't have any written sources to work upon. There are some scattered officers' memoirs, especially on the Second World War, but not really something on the rank and file. The only exception we have about the 5,000 letters, they are gist, which have been written by the Indian soldiers during First World War from France, and the gist are in the British Library. But too much work have been done on it. Susan Vankosi, recently Gajendra Singh, and also by David Omisi. But beyond that, we really don't have anything. Now, a historian has to be a detective at some time also. I remember that about 5-6 years ago, just by chance, I discovered a journal or an autobiography stroke quasi-biography by one Bengali officer, Captain Kalyan Kumar Mukhopadhyay, in South Calcutta at Gold Park, where I live, in an old bookshop. It is in Bengali. It's privately printed by his grandmother, Mokkhuda Devi, who happened to be a zamindarni, female zamindar of West Bengal. Mokkhuda Devi's grandson was Captain Kalyan Kumar Mukhopadhyay, and he was a doctor. He was studying at London, and then when the First World War broke out, he got an emergency commission and he joined the British Indian Army and served in Mesopotamia till his capture and death in Mesopotamia, especially after the siege of Kut al-Amara. Now, this autobiography was privately printed in 1928. As far as I know, the only existing copy lies with me, which I am now translating with a lot of editorial and authorial intervention for Center for Armed Forces Historical Research, and thanks to Rana Chinna for supporting this endeavor. Now, what this autobiography speaks about, I could categorize 2 important issues which this autobiography speaks about. It is an officer's autobiography. It's not voice from the rank and file. And secondly, mind you, as we have discussed already, that due to the operation of martial race theory, no Bengalis were indeed in the combatant branch except in the few here and there. So this guy is actually in the Indian Medical Code, not in the combatant, but he throws light on how the soldiers fought why. So the 2 issues with which this autobiography deals with, one is combat motivation, second is nature stroke face of war, John Keegan's famous phrase. Combat motivation, why men joins the army and why they fight. Omar Bartov, in his classic study of the Wehrmacht, has rightly said that combat motivation could be divided into 2 categories, pre-combat, in-combat motivation. Pre-combat motivation is that the ideas with which one joins the army. In-combat motivation is actually when the war was going on, all those beautiful ideas flies away through the window from the head, and then why men fight. So what about Captain Kalyan Kumar Mukhopadhyay's pre-combat motivation? Captain Kalyan Kumar Mukhopadhyay, he was married to a princess of Kuch Bihar and was settling down to a practice in London. And all Bengali mothers and grandmothers would like their sons to have such a life. But unfortunately and strangely, Mokkhuda Devi, grandmother says, no, Kalyan, you should join the army and fight and die and not be an martial Bengali. Point to be noted. All historians, sociologists say that martial race theory is a British creation. Probably, even it's a British creation, it has seeped into quote-unquote colonial consciousness. Mokkhuda Devi then gives an argument which challenges our nationalist argument about Hindu-Muslim unity in the freedom struggle. He says that once the British lives and the British are going to live, that much is there in the late 20s Bengali Bhadralok mind, and then we have to prevent a resurrection of the Mughal Empire by the Pathans and the Afghans who are real Muslims. We don't have to fear the Bengali Muslims because they are like us. So to prevent a resurrection of the Mughal Empire by the Pathans, Afghans, Afridis from Waziristan, Badland of present-day Pakistan, Bengalis must not be effeminate, but they must get military training, and they must get it by serving in the British-controlled army, if not for empire, for yourself. And then Mokhuda Devi actually gives two examples. One, how Sher Shah actually served in the Mughal army and then challenged the Mughals, Farid Khan, and before that Chandragupta Maurya, who actually served in the Greek army of Alexander, and later after Alexander's death challenged it and established the pan-Indian Maurya Empire. So under pressure of Mokhuda Devi, and Mokhuda Devi says, look, Kallan, if you don't join, I will cut off from your family money, and that's really trouble. If you are a wealthy man, if your grandmother who is controlling wealth says that you will not inherit anything unless you mind my wishes, that's a problem. Generally, grandmothers forces their grandkids to marry according to their wishes. But here, there's a different thing. No military service, no money. So poor Kallan joins the army. Pre-combat motivation. Now in combat motivation, bullets were flying, cannons were firing in the hot deserts of Iraq as General Townshend was advancing against the Turks, and they were falling back. And Kallan was in charge of the ambulance corps. Kallan now writes detailed letters to his ma that war is a horrible business. I mean, here is a similarity. We find the letters by the German soldiers also, which have been reprinted and published, that, I mean, the Eastern Front conditions are horrible. I mean, so much about Nazism, etc., we have to survive. So Kallan says there is no liberalism, no idea, nothing. We just have to survive day by day. And the real dangers for Kallan, he writes, a disease and lack of food. In fact, starting from Thukydides till Second World War Battle of Stalingrad, most soldiers died due to disease, lack of food. If you believe Anthony Bevel, ice in Leningrad. Similarly, most of the Turks and the British and the Indian, Kallan says racial discrimination, Indians' conditions are horrible. Regular and worse is the irregular soldiers, because no food, no clothes. He says, I am smelling badly, I don't have a bath. So all these basic, I will not say basic instinct, all these instincts which you take for natural, these are denied to him. So then Kallan says, I have to go on fighting to survive, and then I am getting military training, because no ideas, only survive. And here Kallan speaks about group solidarity, something which the American sociologists also speak about group solidarity, inmate group feeling. That when the group solidarity is there, then the cohesiveness is there, and a small unit survives in the heat of battle. When group solidarity disintegrates, then the army disintegrates. And Kallan speaks about the group solidarity. I will not go into the greater debate about the military sociology about group solidarity, its influence on the Wehrmacht, lack of it for the US Army in Vietnam, but that's it. It now leads us to my second issue in the autobiography about the nature of war, or to repeat John Keegan's memorable phrase, the face of war. And the face of war was indeed ugly. Again, I mean, as Kallan writes detailed letter about the siege of Kut, where malaria, plague, gangrene was breaking out, one is reminded of Thucydides' description of the city of Athens when it was besieged by the Spartans, and Kallan was actually making this conference. He was making this conference. He was, after all, an educated gentleman, not an ordinary soldier. And then Kallan, what comes out in him is that he says that unlike ordinary soldiers who harbors hatred against the enemy, I cannot harbor hatred against the enemy because I am a medical officer. So instead of sympathy, which the British officer shows for the natives, oh, poor native soldier, Jamadar, his leg have been blown away, right leg, and he was bleeding profusely. Kallan, to use E.P. Thompson's phrase, he was showing empathy. And empathy for both sides, for the British, for the Indians, and for the Turks also. And Kallan says this humanism is essential because I am a doctor and I am not a army officer or a soldier. Ironically, when Kallan was actually mending and giving injection to a Turkish soldier at the outskirts of Kut al-Amara, he was wounded by a bullet on his left shoulder. And despite being wounded, he carried on his task. He didn't go to the doctor or didn't take leave because he says that more wounded, grievously wounded British and Indian and Turkish soldiers are there. As a doctor, I cannot shirk my responsibility and go for leave and medical attention. What happens is that after 2-3 months, when Townshend surrenders and then the Turks really don't have the infrastructure to keep so many soldiers in proper captivity, they started marching the defeated prisoner of war up towards Baghdad. And in that horrible march, about which some description from Kallan's letter survives, Kallan succumbed to death, and that the last letter. As summing up, Mukunda Devi says that this is not a sacrifice in vain. It's a sacrifice, one, not for British imperialism. This is a point which we must note. I mean, loyalty is not innate. Indians are fighting, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Afridis, they are fighting the imperialist armies. One way of looking at it, they are fighting for the Raj. They love the Raj so much. Another is that there are different layers of loyalty which needs to be dissembled, and this fractious, multidimensional loyalty or mentality has to be, we have to speculate and bring it out. Mukunda Devi says that Kallan died for a Bharat which would include Hindus, Muslims, but not the Afghans and Pathans. And for that, military training of all the communities are necessary, and there the autobiography ends. I will end this talk. I think I have kept within time. I mean, generally, historians and scholars have a bad habit. They go on speaking, and when I am at the listening, I feel so bored. So I think my operation remains within time. So 2.1, how far Mukunda Devi's vision has been accomplished in independent India. I mean, here we have a senior armed forces officer. The Indian armed forces and the Pakistani armed forces continue to recruit from the martial races of the subcontinent. The recruitment break hasn't occurred, one. Number two, despite this autobiography, what is the future of history from below or new history, forgotten history of the colonial soldiers about First World War and Second World War, the two great wars of that totally Krieg. About the Indian soldiers, I will say that we need more sources, which probably is not more forthcoming. I'll end this talk by quoting Karl von Clausewitz, who rightly said that, you know, the only thing predictable about war is its unpredictability, unpredictable nature. So I would end, what is the future of history from below, forgotten histories of the Indian soldiers about the Great War? Well, unpredictable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was moving and that was quite passionate also. Let's go for a quick tea break, and we come back in 10 minutes, at the most 15 minutes, and we come back and then we'll have the next two papers.